Hello everyone, my name's Louise and thank you for coming to join this video today where we are talking about earthquakes, the science behind them, how they affect communities, all that kind of thing. So first of all, what is an earthquake? So an earthquake is when we have natural vibrations caused by sudden movements in the Earth's crust. And the crust is that thin layer we have around the outside of the Earth. So they're a kind of natural hazard. And what do I mean by natural hazard? That's a natural event which causes damage to our property, things like houses or farms, or to people, or also to the environment. Other natural hazards are things like volcanoes, tsunamis, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. All those things are naturally occurring events which cause damage to property, people, or the environment. So earthquakes are natural hazards because the shaking of the Earth's surface can cause buildings to collapse, they can injure people, can cause flooding, can cause tsunamis, and can kill thousands of people sometimes, so they can be really very dangerous. Geologists study earthquakes to understand where they might happen and how people can be prepared and protected for when an earthquake strikes. So we're going to have a look at that, about how geologists you can't predict always earthquakes, but we can know where they might or where they're more likely to happen. So let's think about that, about where on Earth do earthquakes happen. So going back to this picture of the structure of the Earth, we have the inner core in the middle, which is like solid, really hot, but really solid metal. The outer core is also really hot, but it's liquid metal. The mantle around it is made of kind of solid rock materials, and then the crust all around the edge, that's the bit where we all live, in the Earth's crust, which has oceans, mountains, landmass, all that happens in the crust. So where on Earth do we get our earthquakes? The Earth's crust and the upper part of the mantle make up kind of a thin skin that goes around the surface of the Earth. And that skin is not all in one piece, it's broken up into huge slabs, a little bit like a giant jigsaw puzzle, like what we've got on the screen now. We can see it all kind of fits together, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but it's not one smooth skin. All of these puzzle pieces, these plates, are called tectonic plates, and the edges of the plates are called plate boundaries. And these plates aren't completely fixed in place. They move around on the surface of the Earth. We can't feel them moving because it's happening really, really slowly, but all the time they are slowly moving. And we can see on the map all of these red lines are our plate boundaries, which show you the differences between the tectonic plates. And if we have a look again, we can see the names of some of the major plates. So obviously we've named them, as we've discovered them, generally after the areas of the globe that they're on. So the Eurasian plate encompasses Europe and most of Asia. And we can see immediately that Eurasian plate is pretty big. We don't really have any of our plate boundaries crossing through Europe. Whereas if we look over to Central America, for example, that part between North American plate and South American plate, there's lots of plate boundaries there. So the Central America is sitting between lots of our tectonic plates. So the next map, we've got the same map but with lots of yellow dots added to it. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think that these yellow dots might represent? What they are showing is the location of major earthquakes on Earth. So all of the major earthquakes that have ever happened, plotted on this map, are with yellow dots. And what's the first thing that we're going to notice about the location of those yellow dots is that they're almost always very near or exactly on our plate boundaries, so the red lines between our tectonic plates. And that's because almost all earthquakes that happen on Earth happen in the zone between two or more different plates on those so-called plate boundaries. Okay, so areas like Europe, which are within one tectonic plate, the Eurasian plate, don't suffer all that many earthquakes, not in kind of northern Europe or in Western Asia. If we go more south, we can see we get that line. So in Southern Europe, we get more earthquakes. And then again, moving over to places like Central America, those islands around there as well, lots of earthquakes in that area. Places like New Zealand, sitting between multiple tectonic plates, they suffer from lots and lots of earthquakes. So it really makes a big difference where in the world you live. So next thing we're going to think about is, why do we get earthquakes? So the edges of those tectonic plates are really jagged and rough. They're not smooth. So when they push and grind past each other at the plate boundaries, we get lots of what we call friction. So that's all that says under my face there. It says lots of friction. And friction is a force that we get when objects push together. Even if I rub my hands like this, I'm creating friction there, and it's a force because the movement energy of my hands there is being changed into friction energy, which comes from two objects rubbing together. So the same thing is happening with these massive tectonic plates when they rub together. And obviously, if my tiny hands are creating a little bit of friction, these giant plates create lots and lots of friction when they rub past each other. And then sometimes what happens is when these plates become locked together, they get stuck. And all that friction energy that would normally cause the blocks to move past each other, that movement energy, is stored up. So that energy just grows and grows and grows, and we create a stress there. And eventually, the stress builds up so much that the plates suddenly jolt into a new position. And that movement releases vibrations called seismic waves, which travel through the earth, shaking the surface of the earth and everything on it. And that's what an earthquake is. So the plates moving together, normally they move past each other, and then they kind of get a bit stuck, and all that movement energy gets built up. Then all of a sudden they like that. And that hard jolt is what makes the earthquake. The point at which the earthquake occurs below the surface, where those tectonic plates have that jolt, is called the focus. And the point directly above the focus on the Earth's surface is known as the epicenter. So if you've ever heard of this term before, the epicenter of the earthquake, it's exactly where below the tectonic plates have had that really big movement. And then from this point, the epicenter is where all of our seismic waves, those vibrations, move out from. So that's the very middle point of the earthquake. And thinking about those seismic waves, those vibrations, we have 3 different wave types created from an earthquake. So when an earthquake happens and it releases those vibrations, they all travel outwards from the focus in every direction. So geologists measure these at different stations around the Earth to figure out where the earthquake has occurred. And to do that, they identify the 3 different types of waves. So we'll just go through them. So the first type that we have on the left with that black squiggly line, they're called surface waves. And they travel all around the edge of the Earth's crust, away from the focus in all directions. So it doesn't just happen in 2. If the focus is here, it's happening all down the side of the Earth on in all different directions. And they move from side to side, and they move up and down as well. And it's these surface waves which are causing most damage that we see as humans. It's causing damage to buildings when we have an earthquake. The second type of seismic wave, the one we've got in the middle, those red ones, is called a P wave. And P waves travel through the whole Earth, including the Earth core. So instead of just going around the crust, around the edge, it will go straight through the middle of the Earth as well. And they travel through the Earth by pushing and pulling rocks in the direction that they are travelling. The third type of seismic wave, which we can just see there, the blue one, is called an S wave. And these ones move from side to side as well as they go forwards. And these also move through the centre of the Earth, but they cannot travel through liquid. So if you remember back to the start, I said that the Earth's outer core is made from liquid metal. So that's why we can see on the diagram there, they get stopped at that outer core because they can't move through liquid. So we have surface waves, P waves and S waves. There are 3 different types. And how are these waves measured? So geologists, they're the people who study things like earthquakes, they measure seismic waves using instruments called seismographs. So in the past, seismographs worked in a very kind of rudimentary, basic way, but they still worked really well. That what they would have was a pen suspended on a weight that then drew a line onto a rotating drum covered with graph paper. So we can see there the pen on the weight is drawing a line like this. When the ground shook in an earthquake, the drum would go up and down, so the pen would make a wiggly line on the drum. And the more the ground shook, the wigglier the line would be. The greater the magnitude of the earthquake, the bigger, the stronger the earthquake was, the higher those lines would go as well. So that was our old-fashioned seismograph. The modern seismographs we have today work using the same basic principles, except now instead of the pen and paper, they use electromagnets, which will generate a voltage when there's an earthquake. That's basically a spike of electricity when there's an earthquake, and this voltage is then transmitted to a computer display. It's exactly the same principles, they just kind of made it a little bit more sophisticated by using electricity. It's a bit more accurate now. Obviously, we can see there would be some times when it might go a little bit wrong just with a pen going up and down. So that they are how we measure our earthquakes. So as I just said before as well, the strength or size of an earthquake is called its magnitude. The bigger the earthquake, the more energy there was stored up in those tectonic plates stick together, the more energy is released when they jolt apart, and the bigger the earthquake's magnitude. An earthquake with a large magnitude will make the Earth's surface shake more and usually cause more damage than a smaller magnitude earthquake. The next thing we need to think about is, how do we locate earthquakes? How do we figure out where exactly that focus and that epicenter was? And geologists do this, as well as working out how big the earthquake was using their seismographs. They can use that information to help them work out where exactly the earthquake has struck. And that helps us plot all those yellow dots on that map we saw before. They do this by looking at the P and the S seismic waves. So S waves travel much slower than P waves. So they're all starting from the same epicenter, and then they start to move out. And if I've got an S and a P wave, the P wave is moving much faster than the S wave. So that means that the further away we are from the earthquake's epicenter, the more spread out those two waves will be. If we measured with our seismograph right 1 meter away from the epicenter, they're pretty much going to be together because the P waves haven't had much time to gain a head start on the S waves. But if we measure 100 miles away or even more, that gives the P waves time to gain distance on the S waves, so they will arrive first on our seismograph. So that's how they figure out where exactly the earthquake has struck. And that last point is just to say that the surface waves are the ones that travel the slowest, they arrive last. So now we have this information, we can measure how big earthquakes are, where they struck, and then we can plot a pattern of where they're most likely to strike. We can try and prepare ourselves for earthquakes. So one thing we can do is design our buildings in a way to battle against being destroyed in an earthquake. So it's impossible to predict when and where and how big exactly an earthquake will occur, but it is important for those earthquake-prone countries like Japan or New Zealand to be prepared at all times. And engineering buildings to withstand earthquakes is really important, and a good example is in Tokyo in Japan. That's a really earthquake-prone place, and they have designed their buildings to try and not crumble when an earthquake happens. The first thing they can do is engineer buildings which can wobble instead of remaining still in an earthquake, because that can stop them from collapsing. If we get a shake and the building can absorb some of that shake energy by wobbling itself, instead of staying still and then it will just crumble, that will stop it collapsing and will potentially save thousands of lives in a big earthquake. There's lots of other things that we can do to try and stop building collapsing. We can have computer controlled weights on the roof. We can build them from fire resistant materials, because fires are another thing that often happen in earthquakes. We can install automatic shutters, which will come down when an earthquake starts and prevent the windows from shattering and injuring people. We can make sure buildings have good road access for people to escape, for open areas for evacuation, and also for emergency services to get in. You can build on foundations sunk into solid rock and then have rubber shock absorbers. Lots of things to try and stop that building from crumbling down. You can either rebuild buildings in this way, kind of start from scratch, or you can retrofit them. So we take an old building and we update them with some of these things to try and keep them safe in an earthquake. The last thing is that educating the public is really important so that they know what to do if they feel an earthquake coming. Generally, people living in these earthquake-prone countries really know what to do, they know where to go, but generally staying indoors under a sturdy table or a door frame is the safest thing to do. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction into the science behind earthquakes and how it works in day-to-day life. I'm going to do some more videos on other natural hazards, natural disasters as well, on volcanoes, tsunamis, so do have a look at them as well. It all ties together. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you.